As the clock struck midnight in the Apostolic Palace, a quietness unlike any other crept into the Pope's chambers. This wasn't just ordinary silence. It was the kind that feels thick, sacred, and foreboding. Time, for Pope Francis, had slowed. Every tick of the ornate Vatican clock echoed like a drumbeat toward eternity. Doctors moved gently. A nun wiped his brow. Outside, St. Peter's Square stood dark and empty, lit only by moonlight. The world didn't know yet, but inside that room, history was being made in whispers. No declarations, no last-minute summons, just the sound of slowing breath, the rhythm of a life spent in service approaching its final note. It was here, in this sacred pause, that the final hour of Pope Francis began. Not as a pontiff, but as a fragile man reconciling with his God, his past, and the weight of what he would leave behind. Maria Elena's tearful arrival. When Maria Elena Bergoglio arrived at the Vatican, the staff parted without a word. She wasn't just the Pope's sister. She was his anchor to the life before the white robes. The moment she stepped into the room, his fading eyes fluttered open. "Hermana," he breathed, barely audible. She rushed to his bedside, clutching his hand like it was the last lifeline she had. She whispered stories from their childhood in Buenos Aires, bringing back laughter, old prayers, and warm memories only siblings share. The Pope didn't speak much. His strength was fading, but tears welled up as Maria Elena reminded him who he was before the world called him Holy Father. In that moment, he wasn't the head of 1.3 billion Catholics. He was Jorge Mario, her brother. What passed between them wasn't theological. It was pure human love, the kind that doesn't need words, the kind that makes death feel not like an end, but a return, his final blessing to the invisible Pope. Francis lifted his hand with great difficulty. There were no cameras, no cardinals gathered in pomp, just a small group of caregivers, aides, and nuns. But he raised his trembling fingers in the sign of the cross. Who was he blessing? The living? The lost? Or perhaps the unseen? In his final moments, it seemed he was offering absolution not just to the room, but to a world hurting far beyond those Vatican walls. His voice cracked. Misericordia. Mercy. That one word, soft as breath, seemed to radiate into the room. For decades, Pope Francis championed the forgotten, the marginalized, the abused. Now, as he teetered between two worlds, his last gesture was for them. It wasn't scripted, it wasn't ceremonial, it was raw, personal, and holy. A final spiritual act not for power, but for peace. The kind of blessing only a dying man could offer, without ego, without agenda. Just love. The secret visitor. After midnight. At 12:27 a.m., a man cloaked in black entered through a side door, escorted by the Swiss guard with no announcement. I don't know his name. He wasn't a cardinal. He didn't wear robes. But Francis opened his eyes when he saw him and nodded. There was recognition. The man knelt beside the Pope and whispered for almost 5 minutes. No one dared interrupt. Maria Elena watched cautiously, her face unreadable. When the man stood up, Pope Francis said something in return, his voice faint but deliberate. "Let them know I forgive them." Then the visitor left just as quietly. To this day, no Vatican record mentions him. Some believe he was from the Curia. Others whisper he was a messenger from a persecuted group, perhaps even an old Jesuit friend involved in something secret. But whoever he was, he carried a message in and out of that room, one that only the dying Pope could speak aloud. Confession at the edge of life. It was subtle, but unmistakable. The Pope, now barely able to speak, gestured for the chaplain. Father Donato approached, placed his stole around his neck, and leaned close. What followed was a confession. Private, broken, whispered. No one will ever know what was said. But as Donato placed his hand on the Pope's forehead and uttered the prayer of absolution, the tension in the room shifted. Francis closed his eyes. A single tear rolled down his cheek. What does a pope confess at the end? Doubt? Anger? Regret for things left undone? Perhaps even guilt for what he couldn't stop within the church itself. In that holy sacrament, he was no longer a pontiff or prophet. He was a soul on the threshold, seeking peace before stepping through the veil. It was quiet, raw, and sacred. And for those of us who witnessed it, it was the most human moment we had ever seen. The photo he asked to see one last time. As dawn slowly crept over the horizon, casting faint light through the draped windows, Pope Francis did something unexpected. With barely any strength, he motioned for a small leather pouch kept beside his Bible. Inside was a faded photo, creased, weathered, and worn from years of quiet reverence. It was of his parents, sitting outside their home in Flores, Argentina, laughing over coffee. Mi familia, he whispered. His thumb traced their faces slowly, his eyes watering with nostalgia. Papá, mamá, estoy viniendo. The room fell into silence. In that fragile moment, we didn't see the Pope. We saw a man reaching back through the years, longing not for glory or legacy, but for home. That old photograph was his anchor to innocence, to youth, to the warmth that existed long before politics and papal burdens. He held it to his chest, his breathing shallow. This wasn't just a memory. It was his quiet farewell to the only people who ever truly knew him before the world did. His final words to the church. With his voice raspy and thin, Pope Francis asked for a pen. His hands trembled, but his eyes were steady. On a piece of plain stationery, no papal seal, no formality, he began to write. Slowly, painfully, but deliberately. To the church, he began, be less afraid of the world, and more afraid of forgetting the poor. The sentence was simple, but each word carried the weight of a decade's struggle. Scandals, resistance, reforms, silencing. You will be tempted by gold again. Don't let the chalice blind you. We were stunned. It wasn't doctrine. It was a plea. Not for power, but for soul. I am going to meet a judge who knows my failures, he wrote at the end, and I trust him. When he finished, he placed the letter at the foot of the crucifix near his bed. That single page was more than goodbye. It was a cry for the church to remain human, compassionate, and awake after he was gone. The nun who held his hand until the end. Her name was Sister Agnesa, a quiet woman with tired eyes and decades of service behind her. She'd been by the Pope's side since his hospitalization, never seen, never photographed, but always present. And in his final hour, it was her hand he held. Not a bishop's, not a cardinal's, just a humble nun. As his breathing became shallow, she sat beside him, whispering psalms in Spanish, his mother tongue. El Señor es mi pastor. His fingers gripped hers tightly, then slowly loosened. It was Sister Agnesa who closed his eyes when he passed. Not in ceremony, but with a prayer. And it was she who kissed his forehead, tears soaking her habit. For all his global influence, for all the power that swirled in Vatican halls. In the end, Pope Francis didn't choose grandeur. He chose a servant, a woman of faith, one who had no title but bore the greatest honor, holding his hand as he slipped quietly from this world into the arms of God. The clock that stopped at 3:42 a.m. At exactly 3:42 a.m., the ornate clock above the Pope's bed inexplicably stopped. Its gears jammed, its pendulum froze. No one noticed at first, until a nurse gasped and pointed. "The time," she whispered. and then we all knew. That was the moment. The Vatican wouldn't confirm his death publicly for another 2 hours, waiting for protocols, for cardinals, for statements. But those of us in the room didn't need an announcement. We felt it. A stillness descended, not just in the air, but in our bones. It was as if the universe paused with him. The death of a pope is usually marked with ringing bells, ceremonial processions, official declarations. But this was different. This was quiet, intimate, a soul departing, and time itself seeming to bow in reverence. That frozen clock remains untouched in his private chamber. Some say it should be repaired. Others believe it should remain exactly as it is, a silent witness to the moment heaven opened. What the cardinals said after everyone left. After the final rites were performed and the room slowly emptied, one man stayed behind. Cardinal Luis Antonio Tagle. He stood in the doorway, staring at the Pope's still body for several minutes. Then, when he thought no one was watching, he whispered something. I couldn't hear all of it, but I caught the end. You were always braver than me. There was no arrogance, no performance, just vulnerability. Tagle walked slowly to the foot of the bed, placed a small wooden rosary on Francis' chest, and crossed himself. He lingered a moment longer, his lips moving in silent prayer, or perhaps apology. He had been both an ally and a rival in Vatican circles. Some suspected he was next in line. But in that moment, he wasn't a politician or a prince of the church. He was a man facing the ghost of conviction, and maybe haunted by everything unsaid between them. Then he turned, walked away, and never looked back. The silent tears of his personal secretary, Monsignor Fabian Ruiz, had served Pope Francis for over a decade, through wars, scandals, reforms, and triumphs. But in that final hour, all of his discipline dissolved. As the Pope's breathing grew faint, Ruiz stood near the corner of the room, biting his lip, holding back emotion like a dam about to break. When the moment came, when that final breath left Pope Francis's lungs, Ruiz couldn't stop himself. He dropped to his knees and wept, not like a Vatican official, but like a son losing a father. Their bond wasn't forged through rank, but through shared faith, private conversations, long nights translating sermons and sheltering the Pope from internal chaos. He gave me purpose, Ruiz would later say, voice cracked with grief. For all his training, all his exposure to power and death, nothing prepared him for this farewell. His tears were the kind that only come once in a lifetime, when you lose not just a leader, but the soul that guided your own. The chapel that glowed without candlelight. Shortly after the Pope passed, someone noticed something strange. Down the hallway, in the private chapel near his chambers, a warm glow was emanating from within. No candles had been lit, no bulbs turned on. And yet, the altar appeared bathed in a soft golden light. Those who witnessed it were shaken. Some fell to their knees. Others quietly crossed themselves. Whether it was a trick of reflection or something more divine, no one could say. But in the midst of overwhelming grief, that glow brought something rare: peace. It was as though the room itself knew that a holy soul had just ascended. The chapel, once quiet and solemn, seemed alive. The Pope had often said he felt closest to God in that small sanctuary. Perhaps, on his final night, the space returned the sentiment. Though the Vatican has never publicly acknowledged the incident, the guards who saw it that night still speak of it in hushed, reverent tones. The call from Argentina. That came too late. At 4:08 a.m., just 26 minutes too late, the phone rang. It was a distant cousin from Buenos Aires, calling with trembling urgency. Word of the Pope's critical condition had finally reached the last of his blood relatives. Is he still awake? The voice on the line asked in broken Italian. But by then, the room had gone still. Pope Francis was gone. A nurse gently explained what had happened, and on the other end, there was silence. Then sobbing. "We didn't get to say goodbye," the cousin cried. It was heartbreaking. Despite leading 1 billion Catholics, Pope Francis had only a small, shrinking family in Argentina. He used to joke about it. "The Bergoglios are stubborn, but we die quietly." And in some tragic twist of fate, even his final connection to his homeland arrived moments too late. That missed call became a symbol of how quickly time vanishes, and how even the most powerful man in the church cannot outrun the ticking clock of goodbye. The message hidden in his final blessing. Just before his voice gave out completely, Pope Francis raised his hand weakly in the air. Those present assumed it was a final sign of farewell. But then, slowly, he began murmuring a benediction in Latin. Not a standard blessing, but one rarely heard outside ancient rites. "Domine, dimitte peccata nostra," he whispered. "Lord, forgive our sins." It wasn't for himself. It was for the world, for the cardinals, for the broken, for the forgotten. It was a cry of absolution, spoken by a man who carried the weight of global suffering in his chest. Later, scholars would analyze the phrasing and realize something else. Embedded in the lines was an old Jesuit prayer, one reserved for martyrs. Did he see himself as one? Or did he simply want his last words to echo with humility, not power? Either way, those fragile syllables became sacred. His voice trembled, faded, and then fell silent forever. The nurse who almost lost faith that night. Her name was Maria Santoro, a lifelong Catholic, a nurse with years of experience in papal healthcare. But nothing prepared her for that final shift. She had seen Pope Francis at his weakest, hooked to machines, groaning in pain, but she had never seen him afraid. That changed in the last hour. When his heart faltered, his grip on her wrist tightened. "Pray with me," he whispered, eyes wide, voice trembling. For a brief, harrowing moment, Maria confessed she lost her faith. Watching the Holy Father tremble like any mortal man, doubt pierced her soul like a dagger. How could this happen to someone so close to God? But as she whispered a Hail Mary beside him, something shifted. A calm washed over him, and then her. It wasn't a miracle. It was human connection. It reminded her that even saints tremble before the end, and that faith isn't the absence of fear, but the will to whisper prayers in its shadow.